Okay, there's two main ways to make sparkling wine. One is the tank or the Sherman method. And that's how Prosecco is made. The way you make this is you first start out with a first fermentation. You just make a regular wine. No bubbles, you just make a wine like you would make any other wine. And then to that wine in the tank, you add yeast and sugar. What happens is what yeast does in fermentation is it eats the sugar and it gives off two things. It gives off alcohol. So the wine will have a little more alcohol after this process than it did in the first. But it also releases CO2. Now, when you make the first wine, you make it in an open top container and all the CO2 goes up in the sky and adds to global warming or whatever. But whenever you do the second fermentation, it's in an enclosed tank so that CO2 doesn't get to escape. It stays in the wine, and that's what gives its wine the bubbles. Then what they do is, after a while, the yeast that you put in there dies and it creates a lot of sediment. So they filter the wine, put it in another container, and they add what they call the dosage. The dosage is basically where they add the sugar to the wine to give it the sweetness level that, remember we were talking about the sweetness levels earlier? It gives it the sweetness level for that particular wine that the winemaker wants to give that wine. And then they take that and they put it in a bottle. So this is a simplified way of how wines that use the tank method or the Sherman method are made, which, like I mentioned, the Prosecco we're having tonight. Okay, now we're going to talk about the traditional method of making sparkling wine. It's what they use in the Champagne region and a number of other regions throughout the world. First thing you do, just like in the tank method, is you just make a regular wine. You make a still wine. Then you take that wine and put it in the bottle. And then instead of adding the yeast and the sugar in the big tank like we did in the tank method, you do it right in the bottle. And then what they do is they put a little pop top, old-fashioned pop top on top of the bottle. And the secondary fermentation, the little increase in alcohol and the CO2 that produces the bubble happens in the actual bottle itself. Then what they do is they age it for a period of time, and we'll talk a little bit about the aging in a minute. And they make sure it rests on the dead yeast particles. Remember with the Prosecco, they filtered it out fairly quickly. With traditional method sparkling wines, they let it rest with the dead yeast for a period of time. And what that does is it adds a lot of toasty, yeasty, bread flavors to the wine. So that's one way you can tell if you're drinking a traditional method wine versus a tank method wine is you'll taste a lot of that toasty, yeasty flavor. And the term for that dead yeast is the lees. They use that in a lot of white wine production. If you go to a winemaker and they say we let it rest in on the lees, it means they let it rest with the dead yeast, and that gives it a little bit more complexity, a little bit of that toasty, yeasty flavor. And what they do is they go through a process of riddling where they'll tip the bottle while it's being aged a little bit more and more so that all the dead yeast particles go into the tip of the bottle. And then what they do is after they've aged it for the period of time that they want to age it, they will flash freeze the tip of the bottle. They'll open up the little pop top I talked about. The ice pellet that holds all the dead yeast and a little bit of the wine comes flying out of the bottle. and then they'll add additional wine for the dosage. They'll add the sugar and additional wine to get it to fill the bottle back up again. And then they will label and put the cork in the actual bottle that all this magic happened. And so when you buy a bottle of champagne, or anything that's made in the traditional method, all of this magic, a lot of this magic happened in the actual bottle that you purchased. If you ever walk through a winery that makes traditional method champagne, you'll see just thousands of bottles that are aging on their sides, and every couple hundred you'll see the back of the bottle is blown out because there was a defect in the bottle, and with all the pressure in the bottle, the bottles break.